November 13th, 1942. 01:48 hours. Captain Tameichi Hara, standing on the bridge of his destroyer Amatsukaze, clutched the rail as if it were the last tether to sanity. Suddenly, the darkness split. A blinding American searchlight tore across the waves, locking onto his ship like the gaze of a predator. And then, hell opened. Shells screamed through the night, ripping into the water, detonating with volcanic force all around him. He could feel the ship's steel tremble with every concussion, hear the tearing of metal as fragments scythed across decks. His gunners returned fire with carefully aimed shots, precious shells counted out like jewels. But the Americans, no, they weren't aiming at all. They were vomiting steel into the void, a storm of fire so thick it turned night into artificial day. Hara would later scrawl in his diary, his handwriting shaking across the page. They are not aiming, they are simply filling the sky with metal. In those words lies the seed of a realization the Japanese Navy could never admit aloud. In that single 35-second stretch of chaos, the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco fired more shells than some Japanese destroyers carried for an entire mission. One ship, in half a minute, unleashed the weight of an arsenal Hara's fleet could only dream of. 2,700 miles away at Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being loaded with the next 15,000 tons of shells. Enough to replace every round fired in this battle, not once, not twice, but 50 times over. That same morning in Tokyo, naval planners sat hunched over ration tables, deciding whether convoys could afford 12 shells per gun, whether a destroyer could survive its mission if it fired too many. Hara would survive the war, becoming the only Japanese destroyer commander to fight from Pearl Harbor all the way to the surrender. And yet his greatest torment wasn't the constant battles, it was the numbers. He saw what others refused to see, the mathematics of defeat, written in brass casings and cordite smoke. America's war machine wasn't just bigger, it was limitless. And for Japan, every shell was a choice. Every round fired was one step closer to silence. Months before Captain Hara's night of terror off Guadalcanal, another Japanese officer was already sensing the abyss opening beneath his nation's feet. Commander Masatake Okumiya, an aviator and tactician, was watching the unfolding chaos of the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. It was supposed to be a battle of precision, of discipline, of Japan's razor-sharp naval edge. But what Okumiya saw shook him far deeper than the loss of ships. American dive bombers screamed out of the sun, not in neat formations, not in perfect synchrony, but in waves of reckless audacity. Their bombs splashed around Japanese carriers, geysers of seawater erupting like furious fists. Many missed. Dozens missed. Yet it didn't matter. They kept coming. They came again and again, with a persistence that seemed almost inhuman. Japanese analysts later noted, the Americans fired more bullets into the sea than into their targets, but where Japan saw waste, Okumiya saw something else, something darker. Every American pilot fought as if ammunition was infinite, as if the ocean itself would never run dry of bombs and bullets. Okumiya scribbled in his post-battle notes, "The Americans have no sense of limitation. They fight like men who will never run out." He was right. For every carrier Japan sent into battle, carefully stocked with its precious torpedoes and bombs, America could send 2 more, each with magazines bursting and supply ships steaming behind them with replacements. While Japanese factories struggled to deliver 1 new airframe, American assembly lines were already cranking out dozens before breakfast. And the pilots? America had the luxury of training replacements on a scale Japan could scarcely imagine. Okumiya would later admit, in words censored in wartime Japan, that Coral Sea was not simply a battle of ships, it was a battle of production. For every bomb dropped into the ocean, another 3 were already waiting in a warehouse in California. For every crate of ammunition spent in error, another shipload was already on its way across the Pacific. Japan had entered the war believing in spirit, precision, and training. But Okumiya saw the brutal truth. America's weapon wasn't just its ships or its planes, it was the industrial rhythm, the steady heartbeat of factories that never slept. What Coral Sea revealed was only a glimpse. The abyss was waiting, and every Japanese officer who paid attention could feel its pull. June 1942. The waters around Midway Atoll boiled with fire and smoke. Japan had gambled everything, its finest carriers, its most experienced pilots, its best chance to strangle America before the industrial tide could rise. For a brief moment, the rising sun seemed poised to dominate the Pacific. But beneath the chaos of bombs and torpedoes, a quieter, deadlier truth was emerging. One Japan would never escape. As the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu erupted in flames, their decks littered with shattered aircraft and pools of aviation fuel, survivors noticed something chilling. It wasn't only the loss of ships that broke Japan's back, it was the loss of ammunition with them. Each carrier carried thousands of bombs, torpedoes, and carefully rationed shells. And when those ships went down, they didn't just take sailors and pilots to the bottom, they took Japan's irreplaceable reserves. Every Type 91 aerial torpedo that burned aboard Kaga had taken months to build, each requiring scarce steel and skilled hands. Every 250-kilogram bomb lost in the inferno was one less Japan could ever hope to drop. Unlike America, which could replace entire arsenals overnight, Japan's losses at Midway were permanent. The factories back home were already straining, raw materials dwindling under the weight of Allied blockades. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, steel from Manchuria, copper from occupied lands, all funneled into a machine that was now breaking down. American officers, poring over intelligence reports after the battle, noticed something odd. Japanese carrier strikes were smaller than expected, less than half the bomb loads US carriers routinely dispatched. At first, analysts thought it was caution or tactical doctrine. Later, they realized it was necessity. Japan didn't have enough munitions to match America's extravagance. Every torpedo had to count. Every bomb was measured. Every bullet tallied. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the USS Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor battered but alive. Within days, her magazines were refilled, her decks stacked with fresh planes, her squadrons reinforced with new pilots eager to fight. It was as if the battle had never happened. Midway wasn't just the turning point because Japan lost 4 carriers. It was the moment Japan lost the illusion that it could keep pace. From then on, every Japanese officer who looked at his ship's magazines saw not just steel and explosives, but a clock ticking towards silence. Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943. 6 months of mud, blood and fire that turned a jungle island into the graveyard of Japanese illusions. For the men who fought there, it was less a campaign than a slow-motion execution, and the weapon was not always the rifle, nor the bayonet, nor even the shell. It was supply. On the ridges above Henderson Field, Japanese troops clawed at the earth with bleeding hands, digging foxholes shallow and thin. Their artillery, precious, irreplaceable, was dragged forward by exhausted men and half-starved mules. Each gun came with only a few dozen shells. Commanders were forced to decide whether to fire at night or save their rounds for the morning. The order was always the same: use them only when the enemy is certain. Across the line, the US Marines had a different reality. Their 105mm howitzers opened up like thunder, hurling round after round into the jungle, sometimes not even aiming at specific targets, just saturating the darkness to break Japanese morale. Survivors wrote in disbelief, the Americans fire artillery as if it grows from the soil itself. And in a way, it did. Behind every shell lobbed into the steaming jungle was a chain that stretched back to freighters, then to warehouses, then to factories across the American continent. Guadalcanal consumed shells at a rate Japan's planners couldn't even comprehend. During the campaign, the US Navy alone fired more than 900,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. That was more than the entire Japanese Navy had produced in a year. Captain Hara, now fighting in these same waters, watched Japanese destroyers, his own ship among them, risk everything in the Tokyo Express, dashing through moonlight to deliver crates of rice, a few boxes of shells, sometimes nothing more than medical bandages. Men went hungry, guns stayed silent, while across the beachhead American supply dumps towered like cities of steel and cordite. The contrast was unbearable. Japanese soldiers called American barrages drum fire, comparing it to the ceaseless beating of a festival drum that never ended. For them, every round was a precious jewel. For America, every round was a drop of rain in a storm that would never stop falling. By the end of Guadalcanal, the Japanese weren't just outnumbered. They were outproduced, outsupplied, and outlasted. Their spirit was still fierce, their courage unbroken, but courage does not fill empty magazines. The waters north of Guadalcanal soon earned a name whispered with dread: Iron Bottom Sound. So many ships, Japanese and American alike, were sent to the floor there that sailors swore the sea itself had grown magnetic, pulling steel into its depths. And in those black, fire-slashed nights, Captain Tameichi Hara lived through moments that carved themselves into memory with the sharpness of shrapnel. Hara commanded the destroyer Amatsukaze in November 1942, during one of the chaotic melees that historians would later call the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. In theory, the Japanese should have dominated. Their long lance torpedoes were the finest in the world, their night optics unmatched, their crews seasoned by years of war. But when the fleets collided in the blackness, none of those advantages mattered, not against the storm that America unleashed. He remembered the first clash vividly, searchlights stabbing the dark, followed by a deluge of gunfire. The American heavy cruiser USS San Francisco alone fired over 1,200 shells that night. For Hara, the math was unbearable. Amatsukaze carried barely enough ammunition for 2 sustained engagements. If he fired every round in his magazines, his ship would be silenced forever. The Americans, meanwhile, fired as if supply ships waited just over the horizon, which, in truth, they did. Hara wrote after the war, his words laced with disbelief. The Americans fought with no restraint. We fought as men counting coins. They fought as men scattering stones. Time and again he saw Japanese destroyers forced to disengage, not because their courage faltered, but because their magazines were empty. Meanwhile, American gunners poured steel into the night without hesitation, sometimes hitting nothing, sometimes sinking friend as well as foe, but always firing, always able to fire again. At Iron Bottom Sound, the Japanese Navy began to bleed not only ships, but spirit. Commanders knew they could no longer fight sustained battles. Every engagement was a gamble with stakes they couldn't afford. Every shell fired was one closer to silence, one less to defend the Empire's crumbling perimeter. And Hara, more than most, understood what this meant. Japan wasn't losing battles, it was losing the war of numbers. In the choking smoke and thunder of Iron Bottom Sound, he saw the future, a war Japan could never hope to win. In war, battles are remembered for their thunder, for the shock of guns and the clash of steel. But beneath the noise lies something colder, quieter, and far more decisive. Logistics. At Guadalcanal, Hara and his comrades learned this truth in blood. By 1943, it became impossible to ignore. Japan's supply lines were not arteries of strength, they were a strangling noose. Every round of ammunition carried to the front demanded an impossible journey. Steel had to be mined in Manchuria or occupied China, shipped across seas, stalked by American submarines, refined in Japanese mills that were already starving for coal, and finally manufactured in plants bombed and short of workers. From there, the shells had to be loaded onto freighters, slow, vulnerable freighters, then escorted thousands of miles to forward bases, where destroyers risked everything to dash through the night in the Tokyo Express. By the time a single crate of shells reached the guns on Guadalcanal, it had travelled across half the empire and consumed more fuel than Japan could spare. America's supply lines told the opposite story. A shell produced in Pittsburgh or Detroit could be on a ship in San Francisco within days, and from there steamed along secured routes under the umbrella of overwhelming naval power. The logistical miracle of the U.S. Merchant Marine meant that every island seized became another forward depot, each stacked higher with crates of munitions than the Japanese could imagine. Guadalcanal was the first of these stepping stones. Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, they would follow like dominoes, each one closer to Tokyo. The numbers are staggering. During the Solomon Islands campaign, the U.S. Navy delivered more than 400,000 tons of supplies. Japan, attempting to match it, managed less than 20,000, and most of that never even reached the troops. Starving soldiers begged for rice and bullets. Many received neither. In Tokyo, planners debated whether a convoy should carry food or shells. Both were needed, both were scarce, but the ships could not carry both. It wasn't courage or tactics that doomed Japan. It was arithmetic. The empire was built on fragile lines stretched across vast oceans. America's machine, by contrast, grew stronger with each mile, each port, each victory. And in those numbers, the fate of Japan's navy was already sealed. By late 1943, the war had shifted. The Solomons were behind, and now the Americans drove straight into the Central Pacific, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the Marianas. Names like Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan became synonymous with slaughter, but beneath the carnage lay a terrifying truth. Japan's ammunition reserves were running out, just as America's were reaching flood stage. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders held bunkers carved from coral, reinforced with coconut logs, their machine guns and mortars sighted perfectly onto the beaches. Each man carried only a handful of grenades, a limited stock of cartridges, and the promise that resupply would never come. Still, they fought with fanatical courage. American Marines hit the beaches and were cut down in swathes. But then the counterweight fell: naval gunfire. For 3 days, American battleships and cruisers rained high-explosive shells onto an island barely 2 miles long. Over 3,000 tons of ordnance, more shells than the Japanese garrison had in total, were poured into that tiny scrap of coral. Whole sections of the island vanished under walls of fire. Japanese survivors later recalled the earth itself shaking, men buried alive as magazines ignited, their carefully hoarded stockpiles obliterated before they could even be fired. At Saipan, the scale grew monstrous. U.S. artillery units fired more than 1.6 million shells during the battle, turning valleys into craters and jungles into skeletal wastelands. Japanese defenders, rationed to a fraction of that, had to wait until American troops were nearly on top of them before pulling the trigger. An officer at Saipan wrote bitterly, "We were not defeated by men. We were defeated by their endless shells." The arithmetic was cruel and simple. A single U.S. battleship could hurl more fire in an afternoon than Japan could deliver to an entire island garrison in months. And when those American guns fell silent, it wasn't for lack of ammunition. It was because the Marines needed to advance through the smoke. Behind them, Liberty ships unloaded crate after crate, mountains of shells waiting for the next barrage. Japan's commanders knew the truth, but could not admit it. Each island became a sacrificial altar, defenders ordered to fight to the last because resupply was impossible, ammunition was life, and Japan's lifeblood was gone. June 1944, the Marianas. For Japan, this was the line that could not be crossed. If Saipan fell, American bombers would be within range of Tokyo itself. The Imperial Navy assembled its might for one last decisive gamble, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What followed would be remembered forever, not for Japan's courage, but for the scale of its collapse. The Americans called it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. The phrase may sound mocking, but the reality was merciless. Hundreds of Japanese planes rose into the sky, their pilots often barely trained, some with less than 100 flight hours. They flew with limited ammunition, their magazines filled with rounds hurriedly assembled in factories short of copper and brass. Mechanics whispered that quality was slipping, bullets that jammed, bombs that failed to detonate, but they had no choice. Every plane had to fly, every round had to count. The US carriers, by contrast, unleashed swarms of Hellcats, fast, heavily armed, bristling with 650 caliber machine guns each, their belts stuffed with thousands of rounds. Behind them, more carriers waited, magazines deep and full, with supply ships already steaming in with replacements. If one pilot expended all his ammunition, he landed, rearmed, and returned within the hour. For the Japanese, a spent gun meant a death sentence. The slaughter was one-sided. Nearly 350 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day, many without even scratching an American carrier. Pilots who survived the first clash returned to decks where bombs and bullets were almost gone, their carriers themselves under siege. Ammunition crews scraped the bottoms of magazines, distributing what little remained. One Japanese commander wrote in despair, "We fought the Americans as if throwing pebbles against a cliff." And while Japan's naval air arm bled out, America's reserves seemed infinite. By the end of June, the US fleet had fired so many rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition that destroyers had to temporarily ration their smaller calibers, not because stocks were truly short, but because the constant stream of fire was outrunning the loaders. Within days, fresh supply convoys corrected even that. The Marianas broke Japan's back in the air. The Empire lost not only its finest pilots, but the ammunition and weapons it could no longer replace. The skies over Saipan, Guam, and Tinian belonged to America, and from those skies, the shadow of B-29 bombers soon fell upon the Japanese homeland itself. October 1944. Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Japan threw everything into the fight: battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers. The order was simple: crush the American landings in the Philippines or lose the Empire's last hope. On paper, it looked like a clash of giants. In reality, it was the theatre where Japan's empty magazines were laid bare for the world to see. The Yamato herself, pride of the Imperial Navy, sorted with her monstrous 18-inch guns, still the largest ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed more than a car, a single broadside capable of obliterating an American cruiser. But there was a secret her officers knew and dared not speak. Her magazines carried only a limited stock, carefully rationed, and nearly impossible to replenish. Every time her great guns roared, Japan's arsenal dwindled irretrievably. American battleships at Leyte, by contrast, fired without restraint. Ships like the USS Washington and USS South Dakota carried not just deep magazines, but the certainty that replenishment was days, not months, away. Behind the fleet steamed dozens of ammunition ships, floating warehouses filled with tens of thousands of shells. For every broadside fired, replacements were already en route. In the Sibuyan Sea, wave after wave of American carrier aircraft hammered the Japanese fleet. Pilots returned, reloaded, and launched again in a rhythm so relentless the Japanese mistook it for an endless swarm. On board the Musashi, sister to Yamato, the magazines erupted as bombs ripped through her decks. She sank beneath the waves, taking over 1,000 men, and a vast portion of Japan's remaining heavy ammunition stock with her. At Samar, Japanese cruisers and battleships surged upon a tiny US escort carrier group. Their fire was devastating at first, shells smashing through thin hulls. But as the battle dragged on, Japanese magazines grew dangerously light. Ammunition officers reported dwindling stocks, some turrets forced to cease fire altogether. Meanwhile, American destroyers counterattacked with torpedoes and a wall of gunfire, supplied to the very last round. When the smoke cleared, Japan's fleet was shattered. 4 carriers gone, 3 battleships crippled, dozens of cruisers and destroyers lost. But more than the ships, it was the loss of ammunition, the silent hemorrhage that doomed them. The Empire had fired its last great shots at Leyte. There would be no replacing them. From that moment on, Japan sailed with empty magazines, fighting battles it could no longer afford to fight. April 1945. Operation Tengo. The last voyage of the battleship Yamato. It should have been a moment of glory, a final thunderclap of the world's most powerful warship. Instead, it became the most haunting symbol of Japan's defeat, not because of enemy firepower alone, but because of what Yamato carried, and what she did not. Her orders were suicidal from the start: sail south with a token escort, beach herself on Okinawa, and become an unsinkable fortress, blasting American forces with her legendary 18-inch guns until she was destroyed. On paper, it was the stuff of legend. In reality, it was a death march. Even before she sailed, officers whispered the bitter truth. Her magazines were half empty. She carried just enough shells for a few hours of firing. Her anti-aircraft batteries, bristling with guns, were stocked with barely enough ammunition to repel a single determined attack. And perhaps most damning of all, her fuel tanks were filled for a one-way trip. She could steam to Okinawa, but she would never come home. The contrast with America could not have been starker. By 1945, US carrier task forces prowled the seas with fuel ships, ammunition ships, repair ships, all the logistics of an empire in motion. An American battleship could fight for days, then replenish at sea and return to battle. Yamato, the pride of Japan, could not even make one full voyage. On April 7th, waves of American aircraft descended on her. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, hundreds in coordinated strikes. Her great guns boomed in defiance, hurling shells that shook the heavens. But her escorts fell quickly. Her anti-aircraft batteries ran hot, and within hours the magazines were running low. Shells meant for an imagined duel with American battleships were wasted in desperation against planes. Bomb after bomb ripped through her decks. Torpedoes punched holes into her hull. Fires roared unchecked. Finally, as her bow lifted from the sea, her forward magazine detonated in a cataclysm that split the ship in half. Over 3,000 men went down with her. The largest battleship in history died not in a duel of giants, but in a storm of American air power, and in the quiet, merciless truth that she had been sent out half-empty, a monument to a nation already bankrupt in steel, oil, and ammunition. The Empire had built the greatest warship in the world, but by 1945 it could not even feed her guns. By 1945, Japan's factories no longer roared, they coughed. The arsenal of the rising sun, once a symbol of imperial ambition, was being strangled into silence. The US submarine campaign had cut the sea lanes. American bombers pounded steelworks, arsenals, and shipyards. The result was catastrophic, a nation still at war but no longer able to arm itself. The shortages crept into every corner of the military. Rifle ammunition, once plentiful, was rationed down to a handful of cartridges per soldier. Reports from garrisons in China and the Philippines told the same grim story. Men going into battle with 30 rounds each, some with fewer than 10. In Burma, Japanese troops fought with captured Allied weapons because their own rifles had become useless sticks without bullets. Artillery batteries, once the pride of Japan's ground forces, were reduced to silence. A howitzer that should have fired dozens of shells a day was lucky to see 1 or 2. Some guns were abandoned entirely, not for lack of courage, but for lack of ammunition. An American officer captured diaries from Japanese soldiers on Luzon that read like confessions of despair. We have men, we have spirit, we have no shells. The Air Force fared no better. Factories, stripped of aluminum and copper, churned out aircraft that lacked proper armament. Pilots climbed into cockpits with half-empty belts of ammunition, sometimes just enough for a single burst. Bombs became so scarce that many aircraft were sent on missions with nothing but a steel plate bolted under the fuselage, meant to be rammed into enemy ships. Suicide became strategy, not out of fanaticism alone, but out of necessity. Meanwhile, American industry surged. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Japan could barely manage a fraction of that across the entire war. By 1945, the disparity was so extreme that American troops joked about Japanese bullets as collector's items, rare souvenirs from a collapsing enemy. The silence of Japan's guns was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of exhaustion. A nation that had once dreamed of empire now found itself unable to arm its own soldiers. Spirit could not fire rifles. Courage could not launch shells. And in the factories of Japan, the machines stood still. The war was no longer about strategy or skill. It was about survival, and Japan was running on empty. The blockade had starved Japan's industry. The firebombing would incinerate what little remained. By 1945, American B-29 superfortresses darkened the skies over Japan's home islands. Their mission was not precision, it was annihilation. Factories, workshops, warehouses, and entire neighborhoods were marked as fuel for the flames. On the night of March 9, 1945, Tokyo became a furnace. Over 300 B-29s flew low, dropping napalm-filled incendiaries by the ton. Within minutes, firestorms engulfed the city. The flames moved faster than men could run, consuming homes, workshops, and families in the same breath. Over 100,000 people died in a single night. But hidden within that human tragedy was another death, the destruction of Japan's last industrial heartbeat. Tokyo's small workshops had been converted into war production hubs. Housewives made rifle bolts, children assembled radio parts, elders packed ammunition. When the flames swept through, these improvised arsenals vanished. Machine tools melted into twisted lumps. Stockpiled ammunition cooked off in chain reactions, exploding in alleyways. Japan's industrial base didn't just shrink, it evaporated. The raids continued relentlessly. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, each city burned. Steelworks were gutted, aircraft factories reduced to ash, ammunition plants leveled. What had taken years to build was undone in hours. The Empire's weapons were now being destroyed before they were even assembled. Soldiers at the front began to feel the firebombing's reach. Supply crates grew lighter, new rifles never arrived, air squadrons received planes without engines, or engines without propellers. A captured Japanese officer admitted bitterly, "Our factories exist only on paper now. The Americans bomb the blueprints before the machines are even built." Meanwhile, American industry surged untouched. Cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh roared with steel, while Boeing, Douglas, and Ford rolled out weapons in assembly line perfection. For every Japanese plane burned on the ground, America could build 10 more in a day. For every bullet lost in the ashes, America had warehouses bursting with replacements. The firebombing did not just kill cities, it killed Japan's ability to fight. No matter how brave the soldiers, how loyal the citizens, the tools of war were gone. By summer 1945, Japan's armies were ghosts, fighting with dwindling weapons while their homeland smouldered. The empire had once sought to conquer Asia through fire and steel. In the end, it was consumed by fire and starved of steel. By the summer of 1945, Japan was broken, but not yet surrendered. Its leaders clung to a fragile hope that the Soviet Union might broker peace, preserving the emperor and sparing the nation total humiliation. They imagined Moscow as a mediator, not an enemy. But in August, that illusion shattered in fire and steel. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Hours later, more than 1 million Red Army soldiers poured across the borders of Manchuria, launching one of the most overwhelming offensives in modern history. It was a hammer blow against an empire already on its knees. Japanese forces in Manchuria were shadows of the proud Kwantung army that had once terrified Asia. Once numbering nearly 1 million, they were now ill-equipped, underfed, and stripped of their best troops, who had long since been diverted to defend the Pacific Islands. Their tanks were relics from the 1930s. Their ammunition was scarce. Many units had only a few shells per gun, a handful of bullets per man. Against them came Soviet armies bristling with modern T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and fresh divisions hardened on the battlefields of Europe. The collapse was immediate. Japanese lines crumbled within days. Cities fell one after another, fortresses bypassed or annihilated. Entire regiments surrendered without firing more than a token volley, not from cowardice, but from futility. They simply had nothing left to fight with. Diaries recovered after the war told of machine guns abandoned because there was no ammunition. Artillery silent as Soviet tanks rolled unopposed. The shock rippled back to Tokyo. Leaders who had whispered of using Moscow as a peace channel now realized the truth. The Soviets were not negotiators, they were conquerors. With every mile they advanced, the spectre of a divided Japan grew closer, a mirror of Germany's fate. For soldiers on the ground, the humiliation was even more direct. Men who had been taught that the spirit of Bushido could overcome any weapon found themselves outgunned, outnumbered, and outsupplied at every turn. Spirit could not stop rockets, courage could not halt tanks. And in the fields of Manchuria, Japanese soldiers discovered what had already been proven at Leyte and Okinawa. Without ammunition, without supplies, even the proudest army becomes powerless. The Soviet invasion crushed Japan's last hope of bargaining. Now there was no mediator, no escape. Only surrender or annihilation remained. On August 6, 1945, the sky over Hiroshima shimmered with a light brighter than the sun. A single B-29, the Enola Gay, released its cargo, a bomb codenamed Little Boy. In an instant the city vanished. Tens of thousands were incinerated where they stood, entire districts flattened in a blast so violent it defied comprehension. For Japan's leaders, the message was unmistakable. A new weapon had arrived, one against which no defense existed. Yet, in the halls of Tokyo, disbelief lingered. Some argued that Hiroshima had been destroyed by conventional bombing, not something new. Others insisted that one weapon could not decide a war. But even as they debated, the truth spread. Hiroshima was gone, its factories obliterated, its arsenal melted into ash. 3 days later, on August the 9th, the illusion ended. The B-29 boxcar dropped Fat Man over Nagasaki. Another city turned to rubble, another arsenal erased. Survivors described shadows burned into walls, iron twisted like paper, ammunition stores vaporized before they could explode. Japan's last industrial sparks were snuffed out in 2 blinding flashes. For the soldiers at the front, the bombings were less about horror than inevitability. They had already fought without supplies, already watched their arsenals empty, already faced waves of enemies they could not resist. The atomic bomb was not the first death knell, it was the final one. It made clear what the blockade, the firebombing, and the Soviet invasion had already declared. Japan could no longer fight. Even Emperor Hirohito, who had remained distant through years of catastrophe, finally intervened. On August the 15th, his voice crackled over the radio, the first time his subjects had ever heard him speak. He called upon the Japanese people to endure the unendurable and accept surrender. His words were veiled, but their meaning was clear. The war was lost. Yet the bombs alone did not end the empire. They were the exclamation point on a sentence already written. Japan had bled itself dry of ammunition, fuel, and steel. Its fleets were gone, its skies empty, its cities burned, its armies starving. The atom bomb did not strike a strong nation. It crushed one already broken, one fighting with spirit but without weapons. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final proof that courage could not replace firepower and that no empire, no matter how proud, could survive when its magazines ran dry. August 15, 1945. Across the shattered empire, radios crackled with an unfamiliar voice. It was the emperor himself, breaking centuries of silence to speak directly to his people. His words were formal, poetic, almost distant, but the meaning was undeniable. Japan would surrender. For millions of soldiers and civilians, it felt like the world itself had stopped. In the jungles of Burma, on the islands of the Philippines, in the caves of Okinawa, Japanese troops froze as the news reached them. Some wept openly, others refused to believe it. A few tore their orders apart, vowing to fight on. But beneath the shock and the fury came a quieter realization. Many had already known the truth. They had lived it in empty ammo crates, in silent artillery, in aircraft that never came. The emperor's words only gave voice to what their empty magazines had whispered for months. The war was no longer winnable. When American occupation forces landed on Japan's shores, they saw with their own eyes the state of the empire. In arsenals once meant to produce endless munitions, machines stood silent, rusting. Ammunition factories were reduced to rubble or stripped bare of raw materials. Warehouses that should have been stacked with shells and bullets were empty, swept clean by years of exhaustion. Even the vaunted Imperial Navy, once a terror on the seas, had ships sitting idle, hulls intact but guns starved of shells, fuel tanks bone dry. Soldiers turned in their rifles, many with only a few cartridges still in the pouches. Some surrendered with weapons that had not been fired in months, not because they lacked courage, but because they had lacked bullets. Officers reported entire units that had trained with wooden rifles, preparing to repel an American invasion with bamboo spears. For the Japanese people, the surrender was not just the end of a war, it was the unveiling of a secret their leaders had hidden. The empire had not been defeated overnight by 2 bombs. It had been bled dry for years, strangled by blockade, burned by fire, crushed by steel, and starved of ammunition until even the bravest spirit could no longer hold a rifle steady. Japan's empire had not collapsed in a single moment. It had withered, quietly, shell by shell, bullet by bullet, until nothing remained. The rising sun had set long before the surrender was signed. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay was still, the waters calm, but the weight of history pressed heavy on the decks of the battleship USS Missouri. Around her loomed the might of the victorious fleets, American battleships, British carriers, destroyers from Australia, Canada and New Zealand. Their presence was not just military, it was symbolic. The world had come to witness the death of an empire. At precisely 9 a.m., Japanese representatives stepped aboard. They wore stiff black coats, their faces pale and unreadable, walking slowly past rows of Allied sailors who stood tall in immaculate uniforms. Every detail had been chosen to remind them of the shift in power, from a nation that once dreamed of ruling Asia to a nation brought low, now compelled to sign its defeat. The documents of surrender lay ready on a simple wooden table. General Douglas MacArthur, tall and imposing, presided over the ceremony with a mixture of dignity and finality. "We are gathered here," he declared, "to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." His words carried across the deck and out into the world, sealing the moment in history. The Japanese delegation signed first, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu leaning heavily on his cane, then General Yoshijiro Umezu of the Imperial Army. Their pens scratched across the paper, not in triumph, but in quiet resignation. Behind them stood the ghost of an empire, millions of soldiers dead, cities reduced to ash, fleets sunk, and a homeland gutted of steel and ammunition. Then came the Allied signatures. MacArthur for the United States, Admiral Nimitz, General Xu Yongchang of China, Admiral Fraser of Britain, and others in turn. Each name was a hammer blow, each stroke of ink a reminder that Japan's bid for dominance had ended not with victory, but with total subjugation. Above the bay, hundreds of Allied planes thundered past in formation, a roar of engines that shook the decks. For the Japanese, it was a final reminder of the enemy's strength, an industrial power that had built more planes in a single year than Japan had managed in the entire war. When the last signature was written, silence lingered. The war was over. The empire that had once sought to command the Pacific was finished, humbled not just by bombs and blockades, but by the emptiness of its own magazines. The rising sun had set, and it would not rise again. In the weeks after surrender, Japan was a nation in ruins. Cities lay flattened, railways twisted, factories silent. Millions were homeless, millions more starving. Soldiers returned from distant fronts only to discover there were no barracks, no weapons, no orders, only the stunned quiet of defeat. For an empire built on steel and firepower, the silence was unbearable. The Allies moved swiftly to dismantle what remained of Japan's war machine. Weapons were confiscated by the ton. Rifles were stacked in towering piles, artillery pieces dragged into fields and cut apart with torches. Battleships that had survived the war were scuttled or scrapped. Even the mighty Nagato, once Admiral Yamamoto's flagship at Pearl Harbor, was reduced to rubble by atomic tests. Japan's arsenals, once the symbol of ambition, became graveyards of rusting steel. But amid this dismantling came something unexpected: rebirth. Under American occupation, Japan was forbidden from rearming beyond self-defense. Factories that once forged shells and rifles were redirected to civilian goods. The same precision engineering that had built Zero fighters and naval guns was soon applied to sewing machines, cameras, and radios. Later, it would fuel the rise of cars, electronics, and the technology that made Japan a global powerhouse in peace rather than war. For the Japanese people, the shift was painful, but it was also liberating. No longer would resources vanish into the bottomless hunger of the military. No longer would soldiers march with empty rifles or families melt down cooking pots for bullets. The empire that had bled itself dry was gone, replaced by a nation that learned survival meant creation, not destruction. And yet the memory lingered. Veterans carried the weight of battles fought with empty magazines. Civilians remembered the firebombs, the hunger, the silence of machines that once thundered with production. Even today, Japan's pacifist constitution reflects that memory, the choice to live without the arsenal of empire. The war had proven a brutal truth. Spirit alone cannot sustain an empire. It was not cowardice or weakness that doomed Japan, but the mathematics of war. Steel, oil, bullets, shells. Without them, even the bravest soldier is defenseless. The rising sun had burned bright, but it had burned through its own lifeblood. And when the guns fell silent in 1945, they did so not only because of bombs or enemies, but because Japan had run out of the one thing an empire needs most to survive: ammunition.